You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 3,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. You need to listen to what I'm about to tell you, every word of it, because if you don't, if you dismiss this as just another horror story told for entertainment, then you're part of the problem I've spent 3 years trying to solve. My name is Callas Verrow, and I was a knight of the Harrowed Star for 23 years. 23 years of faithful service to the Church of the Ninefold Flame, believing I was God's instrument of justice on earth. 23 years of killing heretics and apostates and blasphemers, secure in the knowledge that my blade served a righteous cause. They rewarded my devotion with the greatest honour their order could bestow. They gave me Sanct Ordraxa, a blade forged from the bones of 13 saints and tempered in sacred fire. The most holy weapon in their arsenal, they said. A sword blessed by divine will itself. What they didn't tell me was that the saints were screaming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what I was before I learned the truth. You need to know about the kingdom of Astonvale, about the church that ruled it, with prayers on their lips and blood on their hands, about the order of knights who served as their executioners. Astonvale stretched from the storm-battered northern coasts to the mist-shrouded southern marshes, and every soul within its borders belonged to the church. Oh, there were kings and nobles who maintained the pretty fiction that they ruled, but when the pontifex spoke, crowns bowed. When the church demanded tribute, treasuries emptied. When the faith required sacrifice, the innocent died. The Church of the Ninefold Flame wasn't the gentle, forgiving religion you might know from your own world. Our God was a deity of righteous fire, of purifying flame, of absolute judgment that burned away sin and left only ash. The 9 sacred flames represented the stages of spiritual refinement, each one searing away another layer of human weakness until only perfect faith remained. And we, the Harrowed Star, were the instruments of that refinement. They took me when I was 12. My parents gave me willingly, proudly even, weeping tears of joy as the black-robed recruiters led me away from our lowland farm. Their son would serve the divine, they said. He would become something greater than a simple farmer's boy. The cathedral bastion of El Matra was carved into the living rock of Mount Severan, its spires piercing storm clouds that never dispersed. The training halls were vast as airplane hangars, their vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of divine judgment, angels with flaming swords putting sinners to death, saints ascending to heaven, while the damned burned below. The sound of steel on steel echoed through those stone corridors day and night, mixed with the chanting of battle prayers and the rhythmic thud of boots on stone. We learned to fight with sword and mace and crossbow until weapons became extensions of our bodies. We memorized the 9 sacred texts until we could recite them in our sleep. We studied the lives of martyrs and saints, learning how their suffering had purified them, how their deaths had served the greater glory of God. By 18, I believed every word. Brother Commander Harveth led my consecration ceremony. I knelt before the altar of burning souls while he pressed heated brands into my shoulders, searing the church's symbols into my flesh. The pain was transcendent. The smell of my own burning skin was incense to the divine. "Rise, Brother Callas Verrow," he intoned as the brands cooled. "Rise as a knight of the Harrowed Star, sword arm of the faith, instrument of divine will." I rose as something new, something pure, something terrible. For 20 years, I served without question. My first kill was a merchant in the port city of Velhammen, caught selling blasphemous texts imported from foreign lands. I cornered him in his warehouse among crates of forbidden books and strange idols that hurt to look upon. He offered me gold, promised to renounce his ways, begged for mercy. I gave him the mercy of a quick death and burned his inventory in the harbour. The flames could be seen for miles, and the message was clear. This is what happens to those who traffic in corruption. Then came Father Aldrich, in the hill town of Greenvale. He'd been preaching dangerous ideas about forgiveness and redemption, suggesting the church's harsher doctrines might be wrong. The local congregation was beginning to listen, to question, to doubt. I arrived during his Sunday sermon and executed him at his own pulpit, his blood spattering across the sacred texts he'd been misinterpreting. The congregation understood the lesson. Doubt was a disease and I was the cure. Each mission grew larger, more complex. Entire families of heretics who needed to be rooted out. Underground movements that required careful investigation before the sword could fall. Political dissidents who hid their blasphemy behind masks of loyalty. I never failed. I never hesitated. I never questioned. Then came the Thornwick Incident. An entire monastery had turned heretical, the 43 monks abandoning their vows to pursue forbidden knowledge. When my squad arrived, we found evidence that chilled even our hardened souls. Ritual circles carved into chapel floors. Books written in languages that predated human speech. Altars stained with substances that weren't quite blood. We cleansed the place thoroughly. Every monk died that day, along with a dozen novices who'd been corrupted by their teachings. We burned their library, consecrated their defiled chapel, and reported another successful purge. That should have been the end of it. But 3 days later, Brother Matthias was found dead in his cell, throat open from ear to ear, despite the door being barricaded from inside. Brother Keller vanished the same night. We found pieces of his armour arranged in a perfect ritual circle along the mountain paths. Of the 6 knights who participated in the cleansing, only Brother Harveth and I returned alive. Tragic accidents, Pontifex Malvain said when he summoned me to his private chambers. Mountain roads can be treacherous. Bandits, wild animals, unstable ground. These things happen. I nodded and said nothing, though I knew no bandit could have penetrated Matthias's barricaded cell. I knew no wild animal arranges armour in ritualistic patterns. I knew we hadn't encountered anything natural on our journey home. But I said nothing. That's when Malvain presented me with Sanct Ordraxa. The blade was magnificent, 3 feet of steel so perfectly forged it seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The fuller was engraved with intricate script that shifted and moved when viewed from different angles. The crossguard was carved from what looked like ivory, but felt warm as living bone beneath my fingers. This weapon has served our order for over 2 centuries, Malvain explained as he placed it in my hands, forged by St. Valethra herself, using techniques revealed in divine visions. The steel was folded 1,000 times and blessed at each folding. The bone components were taken from 13 of our most sacred martyrs, saints who died in such perfect faith that their very remains radiate holy power. The moment my fingers closed around the grip, I felt them. 13 distinct presences, like whispers at the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was blessing, the spirits of saints lending their strength to the weapon's wielder. The blade felt perfect in my hands, balanced as if made specifically for me. When I cut through the air, it sang a low, mournful note that resonated in my bones. Few are worthy to bear such sacred trust, Malvain continued, but your service has been exemplary, your faith unshakable. This weapon will serve you well in the trials to come. I left his chambers feeling chosen, blessed by divine favour. It wasn't until I reached my quarters that I truly examined the blade. The engravings were names. 13 names in elegant script, each surrounded by decorative flourishes that looked like thorny vines. But some names had been scratched out, deep gouges in the steel that marred the perfect surface. Maria Constance, age 7, scratched out so violently the metal was scored. Thomas Aldwyn, age 12, letters scraped away until only faint traces remained. Elena Thorne, age 19, her name obliterated by what looked like claw marks. I studied those damaged engravings for hours, running my fingers over the gouged steel. Why would someone deface such a sacred weapon? Who would dare scratch out the names of martyred saints? That night, I dreamed of children screaming. I woke in darkness, cold sweat covering my body, and the taste of ash filling my mouth. The blade lay beside my bed, and in the dim light filtering through my window, the steel seemed to pulse like a slow heartbeat. I reached for it, and the moment my skin touched the metal, visions flooded my mind. A young girl with dark hair, kneeling in a stone cell. Tears streaming down her face as robed figures chanted around her. A knife descending, not to grant merciful death, but to harvest something precious while she still lived, something that screamed as it was torn away. A boy barely old enough to walk, held down on an altar while heated metal was pressed against his chest, his cries echoing off stone walls as the branding burned deeper than flesh, searing away something fundamental from his very soul. A young woman pleading for her life, promising to do anything, believe anything, serve anyone, if they would just let her live. The promise answered with laughter and the slow scrape of steel on bone. The visions faded, but knowledge remained. The 13 saints whose bones formed this blade hadn't been martyrs who died for their faith. They'd been children, innocent children murdered to feed something that wore righteousness like a mask. I should have been horrified, should have thrown the weapon aside and demanded answers, should have questioned everything I'd been taught about the church's holiness. Instead, I felt cold clarity settle over me like winter ice. If they'd lied about the saints, what else had they lied about? If they could murder children and call it holy, what other horrors hid beneath their prayers? The blade began teaching me, not through words or visions, but subtler means. When I carried it past certain clergy, it grew warm against my side. Near particular chambers in the cathedral, it trembled almost imperceptibly. When I looked into the eyes of brothers who preached loudest about purity and sacrifice, the steel sang so softly only I could hear. It was showing me the guilty, teaching me to recognize those who wore righteousness while rotting with corruption beneath. My first hunt began with Canon Vich. Vich was beloved throughout the cathedral, a gentle man with kind eyes and soft voice who performed baptisms and was said to have special gifts with children. Novices sought his counsel. Even high-ranking clergy spoke of him with respect. But when I passed his chambers, Ordraxa burned like forge fire against my hip. I began watching him, following his movements, noting habits, studying patterns. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Services, counselling, tending to duties with apparent devotion. The children gave him away. 3 times I watched him select young acolytes for special instruction in deeper chambers beneath Shrivengate Chapel. Boys and girls no older than 10, chosen for their purity and innocence. He'd take them down stone steps with gentle words and kind smiles. Those who returned hours later were different, quieter, more obedient. They moved like sleepwalkers and flinched when adults spoke loudly. Their eyes held a haunted quality no child's eyes should ever hold. The ones who didn't return were said to have been called to higher service, chosen for special missions in distant lands, blessed with divine visions requiring immediate departure. I knew better. The blade had shown me truth in dreams that left me gasping and sick. Vich wasn't counselling those children. He was preparing them, cleansing them, making them ready for altars hidden in the deepest chambers where their innocence could be properly harvested. Baptized souls burned hotter in the forge, he'd been told. Purified innocence made stronger steel. I confronted him on a Thursday night when the cathedral was quiet and most brothers had retired for evening prayers. The chapel was empty except for us, lit only by eternal flames burning before the altar. "Brother Callas," he said when I emerged from shadows near the baptismal font. "You startled me. Is there something I can help you with?" His voice was calm, but I saw fear flicker in his eyes when I drew Sanct Ordraxa. The blade rang like a bell clearing the sheath, sound echoing from every stone in that sacred space. "I know what you do down there," I said, gesturing towards stairs leading to lower chambers. "I know what happens to children you choose for special instruction." Vich's face paled, but he maintained composure. "I'm afraid I don't understand. My work with young acolytes is well documented and approved by church hierarchy. If you have concerns about my methods, I'd be happy to discuss them with Brother Commander Harveth." "The dead can't discuss anything," I replied, stepping closer. The blade grew warm, then hot, until steel began glowing within a light. "How many, Vich? How many innocent souls have you sent to the forges?" His mask finally slipped. Kindly expression fell away, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "You don't understand the sacred work we do here. The sacrifices required to maintain the church's power. Those children serve a higher purpose than they ever could have achieved in life." "They serve your ambition," I said. "They die screaming so you can forge weapons from their agony." He tried to run then, tried to reach stairs that would take him to hidden chambers, where guards waited and escape routes were prepared. But Ordraxa guided my movements with supernatural precision. I caught him before he'd taken 3 steps, my free hand closing around his throat and slamming him against the stone altar. The impact drove breath from his lungs and sent sacred implements clattering to the floor. "Please," he gasped, his gentle facade completely gone. "You don't understand. The children I chose were orphans, foundlings, unwanted. Their lives had no meaning until I gave them purpose. Their deaths serve the greater glory of our faith." "Their deaths serve your evil," I replied, and pressed his palms down onto Ordraxa's glowing edge. The blade burned through flesh and bone like parchment. Vich's screams echoed off chapel walls as steel consumed his hands, leaving cauterized stumps and the smell of cooked meat. But the weapon wasn't finished. Light began pouring from the wounds, not blood, but something brighter, more essential. The light flowed into the blade, and I felt steel grow heavier as it absorbed whatever Vich had stolen from murdered children. When it was over, he was transformed. The kindly mask was gone forever, replaced by something withered and hollow. He looked like a man who'd lived a dozen lifetimes of guilt in seconds. "The others," he whispered, voice barely audible. "There are others, the Shepherds of Ash. They have the remaining blades. They know you're coming." Then he died, collapsing across the altar he'd defiled. I left him for the morning shift to find. Let them explain how their beloved canon had lost his hands to supernatural fire and died clutching a confession written in his own blood. The blade was different after that first kill. Heavier as expected, but somehow easier to wield. The engravings glowed more brightly, and new names appeared among the original 13. The children Vich had murdered, their identities restored to the weapon that should have protected them. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. News of Vich's death spread quickly, along with rumours about the manner of his passing. The official story was accidental death while working with consecrated flames. A tragic mishap that befell even careful clergy. I knew better, and so did others. 2 days after Vich's funeral, I received new orders. A village in the eastern provinces had reported unusual occurrences. Missing priests, desecrated churches, signs of heretical activity. I was to investigate and report back. The village of Thornwick was a 3-day ride through increasingly desolate countryside. Storm clouds gathered overhead, turning the sky the colour of old blood and sending sheets of rain across the landscape. My horse grew nervous as we approached, shying at shadows and starting at every sound. I smelled the village before I saw it. Death has a particular odour, impossible to mistake once encountered enough times. Sweet and cloying, with undertones of copper and corruption that stick to your throat. It hung over Thornwick like fog, growing stronger as I rode down the main street. The first thing I noticed was silence. No dogs barking, no children playing, no sounds of daily life that should fill a thriving community. The second was the birds. Hundreds of ravens and crows perched on rooftops and fence posts, black eyes following my progress with unnatural intelligence. The third was the bell tower. Bodies hung from the stone structure like grotesque ornaments, swaying in the wind. Priests in black robes suspended by chains driven through their rib cages. Their tongues had been cut out and eyes sewn shut with golden thread, but they were still alive. I could see chests rising and falling in shallow, laboured breaths. Fingers twitched occasionally, and soft moaning sounds escaped ruined throats. Someone had kept them alive through whatever torments brought them to this state, preserving them at the very edge of death. Ordraxa thrummed against my side, not with anger but satisfaction. These weren't innocents who'd been wronged. These were guilty men receiving justice, even if it hadn't come from my hand. I left them hanging and continued my investigation. The church was empty, but not abandoned. Someone had been there recently, rearranging the interior in ways that spoke of ritual purpose. Pews had been pushed aside to create open space in the nave, and symbols were carved into the stone floor. Not demonic sigils or heretical marks, but church iconography used in ways that inverted their sacred meaning. The ninefold flame was carved as 9 separate blazes, each containing burned remains of religious texts. The sacred spiral, meant to represent ascension to divine understanding, was inscribed as a descending pattern that drew the eye downward into darkness. Most disturbing was the altar. Someone had stripped away blessed cloth and carved new words into stone. Here lies the Church of Lies, built on the bones of innocents, fed by the blood of children. I traced the carved letters, feeling their rough edges and the rage that had driven the chisel. Someone else knew the truth. Someone else was hunting the guilty, with the same determination I'd discovered. But where were they? My answer came that night when I made camp in the ruined inn. I'd found evidence that at least a dozen families had lived in Thornwick, but there were no civilian bodies anywhere. Only the priests hanging from the bell tower and a few church guards whose remains I'd discovered in what looked like temporary barracks. I was examining official documents found in the church when I heard footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. Someone approaching my campfire from darkness beyond its circle of light. I kept my hand on Ordraxa's hilt but didn't draw yet. The blade was warm but not hot, suggesting whoever approached wasn't immediately dangerous. A woman stepped into the firelight, and I saw immediately why. The weapon remained calm. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders and eyes that held depths of pain I recognized. Her clothes were simple traveller's garb, but stained with blood that hadn't come from her own body. In her right hand she carried a knife that gleamed with its own inner light. Another consecrated weapon. Another blade forged from saints' bones. "You're not what I expected," she said, settling across the fire with casual grace. "When survivors told me a church knight was coming to investigate, I thought I'd have to kill you too." "Survivors?" I asked. She nodded toward the forest surrounding the village. "The villagers. Most of them, anyway. I got them out before the real cleansing began. They're safe now, hidden where the church will never think to look." "And the priests?" Her smile was sharp as winter wind. "Getting exactly what they deserved. Do you know what they were doing here? The real reason they came to Thornwick? I waited. Recruitment, she spat. Collecting children for the forges. Going door to door with official papers and divine mandates, taking every child between 5 and 15. For special training at the cathedral, they said. For sacred service that would honour their families. The blade against my side grew warmer as her story confirmed my suspicions. 23 children, she continued. 23 innocents who would have died screaming in El Mathra's depths if I hadn't intervened. Do you know how I know? Because I was supposed to be one of them, 15 years ago. She held up her knife and I saw its blade was inscribed with names like Ordraxa, but where my weapon bore victims' identities, hers carried the names of those she'd saved. My name is Lyanna Corbett, she said. I've been hunting the church's child takers for 10 years. When I heard they were coming to Thornwick, I decided to make a statement. The hanging priests, I said, are getting a taste of the mercy they showed their victims. They'll die eventually, but not quickly, not easily. They'll have time to think about every innocent life they helped destroy. We sat in silence, each studying the other across dancing flames. Finally, I made my decision and drew Sanct Ordraxa, laying it across my knees where firelight could catch its engravings. Lyanna's eyes widened as she saw the names. 13 saints, she whispered. You carry the first blade, the one they made from Maria and Thomas and all the others. You knew them. Maria was my friend, she said, voice thick with old grief. We were taken together, held in the same cell while they prepared us for the altars. I watched her die. Watch them cut away pieces of her soul and feed them to the forges. I was supposed to be next, but something went wrong. An earthquake, maybe, or divine intervention. The chamber collapsed and in the chaos I escaped. She looked at the blade with mixture of reverence and horror. I've been hunting that weapon for 10 years, trying to free the souls trapped inside. But you're different, aren't you? You're not serving the church anymore. I serve justice, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. For the first time since I'd met her, she smiled with genuine warmth. Then we have work to do together. The Shepherds of Ash are gathering at Geralt Spire for some kind of ceremony. If we move quickly, we can reach them before whatever they're planning comes to pass. What kind of ceremony? The Confluence of Blades, she whispered. According to documents I found, they're planning to merge all 7 consecrated weapons into a single artifact, something they call the Godslayer's Edge. The name sent chills down my spine, a weapon forged from the combined agony of every innocent the church had murdered, empowered with centuries of suffering and hate. We can't let that happen, I said. No, she agreed, we can't. The journey to Geralt Spire took us through the most desolate country I'd ever seen. The church's influence had poisoned the very land, turning fertile fields into barren wastes and crystal streams into channels of brackish poison. Villages stood empty, their populations either fled or consumed by an institution that saw people as resources to be harvested. Along the way, we found evidence of other hunters like ourselves. Overturned church caravans with guards dead and children freed. Burned temples where corrupt priests had met fiery ends. Safe houses where survivors had gathered to plan revenge. The rebellion was larger than I'd imagined. Hundreds across the kingdom had learned the truth and decided to act. Former knights who'd discovered the lies behind their oaths. Survivors who'd escaped the altars. Parents whose children had been taken for sacred service and never returned. They were winning too. The church's power was crumbling as more people learned the truth and chose resistance over submission. But the Shepherds of Ash weren't surrendering without a fight. We reached Geralt Spire on the 4th day, just as storm clouds gathered around its peaks like a crown of grey thorns. The fortress was ancient beyond reckoning, carved from living rock and adorned with spires that pierced the sky like accusing fingers. Impressive, Lyanna said as we studied the stronghold from our concealed position, and well defended. I count at least 50 guards on the walls, plus whatever forces they have inside. I drew Ordraxa and felt the weapon's eagerness. The blade was practically vibrating with anticipation, sensing the presence of its 6 companion weapons somewhere within those stone walls. "We don't need to fight all of them," I said, "just the ones who matter." The infiltration was easier than expected. Whatever ceremony the shepherds were conducting had drawn most defenders into the central keep, leaving outer walls lightly patrolled. We scaled the eastern face in pre-dawn darkness, using climbing gear salvaged from abandoned church expeditions. Lower levels were maze-like warrens of storage chambers and servant quarters, but Ordraxa guided us unerringly toward our destination. The blade grew warmer with each step, its humming song growing more complex as it sensed its siblings' nearness. We found them in the ceremonial chamber at the keep's heart, a vast circular room dominated by an altar carved from a single piece of black obsidian. The shepherds of Ash stood around the altar in ritual formation, their consecrated weapons laid out in a 7-pointed star pattern. Elin Foss was there as Vich had promised, a skeletal figure in midnight robes, his weapons carved from children's shoulder blades and polished to mirror brightness. Beside him stood Lauren Delwyn, his helmet fused to his skull with molten gold, and his sword forged from infant's ribs. The youngest was Ormist Halvir, his hair white as bone dust despite his apparent youth. The weapon he carried was cruelest of all, a flail made from adolescents' fingerbones, each segment inscribed with the last words they'd spoken before darkness took them. At the altar's head stood Prelate Anvine, said to possess the gift of sight. Her weapon was a staff topped with a child prophet's skull, its empty sockets filled with gems that pulsed with unholy light. But it was the figure at the altar's foot who drew my attention most completely. Pontifex Eroth Malvain had removed his ceremonial mask, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, but somehow timeless. His features were perfect, too perfect, as if carved by an artist who'd never seen a real human being. In his hands, he held a dagger, no longer than a child's forearm, its blade black as midnight and inscribed with symbols that seemed to move when looked at directly. The first martyr's blade, the weapon that had started it all. "Begin the confluence," Malvain commanded, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "Let the 7 become one. Let innocence become vengeance. Let suffering become power." The shepherds began chanting in unison, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made my bones ache. One by one, they lifted their weapons and placed them on the obsidian altar, where the blades began resonating with each other like struck tuning forks. That's when Lyanna and I struck. She went for Halvir first, her consecrated knife taking the young shepherd in the back before he could complete his part of the ritual. He went down hard, his flail scattering bone fragments across the stone floor as his life bled out in spreading pools. I targeted Foss, Ordraxa singing its death song as it carved through his defences and opened his throat in a spray of arterial red. He died trying to whisper a prayer, but the blade cut his words short and sent his soul to whatever judgment awaited child killers. Delwyn came at us both, his rib sword flashing in the chamber's eldritch light as he recited verses from the Black Scripture. His helmet rang like a bell with each step, and his movements flowed with inhuman grace. "The Saint Blade thirsts for shepherd's blood," he chanted, bringing his weapon around in a strike that would have beheaded me if I hadn't ducked. "The mountain shakes, the stone turns mud." Lyanna engaged him while I turned my attention to Anvain. The prelate had backed away from the altar, her staff raised defensively, and her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from seeing your own death written in prophetic flames. "I saw you coming," she whispered as I advanced. "In the smoke and fire, I saw the blade that drinks blood and sings of justice. I prayed for mercy." "Did your victims get mercy?" I asked, raising Ordraxa high. She had no answer. Her death was neither quick nor gentle, but it was thorough. The blade drank deeply of whatever essence had given her the gift of sight, and when it was finished, her staff crumbled to dust, and her prophetic eyes went dark forever. Behind me, I heard Delwyn's final verse, as Lyanna's knife found the gap between his helmet and gorget. What was bound in bone and steel shall make the ancient compact real. The final saint has come at last to make the future like the past. He died laughing, calling me the saint who bleeds for justice with his final breath. That left only Malvain. The Pontifex hadn't moved from his position at the altar's head, despite the death of his subordinates. He stood perfectly still, the first martyr's blade held loosely in his grip, watching our approach with eyes that held depths of malice I'd never imagined possible. "My perfect weapons," he said as Lyanna and I flanked him. "Do you know what you've done here tonight? Do you understand the forces you've unleashed?" "We've stopped you," Lyanna said, her knife steady despite the blood covering her from the fighting. "We've prevented whatever abomination you were trying to create." Malvain smiled, an expression worse than any scream of rage. "Prevented? My dear child, you've completed it. The Confluence of Blades was never about merging 7 weapons into one. It was about bringing them together so their combined essence could be harvested by something greater." He raised the first martyr's blade, and I saw that its black surface now reflected the light of 6 other weapons, though those weapons lay scattered and broken around the chamber. "This dagger was forged from the bones of the very first innocent we sacrificed," he continued. "A child whose name we struck from all records, whose existence we erased from history itself. She was the foundation upon which our church was built, the cornerstone of our power." The blade in his hands began pulsing with its own dark light, and I felt Ordraxa grow cold against my palm. Not the cold of metal, but the cold of absolute emptiness. Her agony was so pure, so perfect, that it created a hunger that could never be satisfied. A need that grew stronger with every innocent we fed to it. And now, thanks to your efforts, that hunger is finally strong enough to break free of its constraints. He struck faster than thought, the first martyr's blade sliding between my ribs like it belonged there. But the wound didn't bleed. Instead, it spread silence through my body, cutting away the voices of the 13 saints whose spirits dwelt within Ordraxa. One by one, I felt them being severed from the weapon that had been their prison and their purpose. Maria's voice, which had whispered of justice for the innocent. Thomas's presence, which had guided my hand towards the guilty. Elena's spirit, which had burned with righteous fury at crimes committed in God's name. All of them growing fainter until only silence remained. "You see," Malvain continued, twisting the blade deeper, "the weapons were never the true goal. They were simply containers, ways to store and concentrate the essence of innocence until enough had been gathered. Now that essence returns to its source, to the first martyr whose sacrifice began our holy work." Lyanna screamed something, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. I could see her moving towards Malvain, her knife gleaming, but she moved like someone underwater, too slow to make any difference. The Pontifex pulled his blade free and held it up to the chamber's light. The steel was no longer black, but clear as crystal, and within its depths I could see shapes moving, faces pressing against the transparent surface like drowning souls beneath ice. "Behold the true church of the ninefold flame," he said, reverently, "built not on worship of the divine, but on systematic harvesting of innocence itself. We discovered long ago that there are forces in this world older and hungrier than any god, forces that feed on suffering and grow strong on the agony of the pure." The blade sang, not the mournful hymns I'd grown used to hearing from Ordraxa, but something else entirely. A sound like breaking glass mixed with children's laughter, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "The entity we serve has many names. The Devourer of light, the hunger that walks, the shadow behind the flame. It exists in the spaces between moments, feeding on despair and growing stronger with each soul consumed. Lyanna reached him then, her knife sliding up under his ribs toward his heart, but the blade passed through him as if he were made of smoke, and her momentum carried her forward into the obsidian altar. Malvain laughed, a sound like winter wind through empty churches. Did you think I was still human? Did you imagine I was still bound by flesh and blood? I transcended such limitations centuries ago. I am merely a vessel now, a conduit through which my master's will is expressed. The first martyr's blade began changing in his hands, growing longer and more complex. Additional segments folded out from the hilt, each inscribed with names I recognized. The children from Thornwick, the novices from Elmathra, hundreds of innocents whose lives had been cut short to feed this abomination's hunger. Soon the final phase will begin, he said, his form beginning to waver like heat shimmer. The Devourer will manifest fully in this world, and the age of false gods and empty prayers will end. In their place will come a new era of perfect order, where every soul serves its proper purpose and nothing is wasted. I tried to speak, to protest, to do something other than stand there bleeding silence onto the chamber floor. But the wound the first martyr's blade had left was more than physical. It had cut away something essential, something that connected me to the world of the living. Lyanna picked herself up from where she'd fallen, her knife clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Blood ran from a dozen small cuts where she'd impacted the sharp edges of the altar, but her eyes burned with undiminished fury. "The children of Thornwick are safe," she snarled at Malvain's wavering figure. "The survivors you would have fed to your master are hidden where you'll never find them. Your harvest failed." "One harvest among thousands," the Pontifex replied dismissively. "A single grain of sand on an endless beach. Do you truly think the loss of 23 souls matters to a being that has consumed millions?" He gestured with the transformed blade, and the chamber walls became transparent, revealing visions of the world beyond. Cities burning with cold fire that gave no warmth. Armies of the faithful marching under banners that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. Churches transformed into processing facilities where innocence was harvested like grain in a mill. "The corruption has already spread too far to stop," he continued. "In every kingdom, in every faith, in every institution that claims to serve the greater good, our influence has taken root. The harvest will continue, whether you resist or not." But as he spoke, I felt something stirring in the weapon at my side. Ordraxa had gone silent when the first martyr's blade wounded me, its cargo of trapped souls severed from my awareness. But silence and emptiness are not the same thing. In the void where 13 voices had once whispered, something new was growing. Not the rage of murdered innocents or the hunger of a cosmic predator, but something colder and more implacable. Something that had seen the true face of evil and chosen to oppose it, not from righteousness, but from simple, stubborn necessity. Justice. Pure and absolute and utterly without mercy. I closed my hand around Ordraxa's hilt and felt the weapon respond. Not with warmth or song or any of the supernatural phenomena I'd grown accustomed to, but with the solid certainty of steel forged for a purpose. The blade had become something new in that moment of transformation. No longer a prison for tortured souls, but an instrument of inexorable judgment. Malvain noticed the change immediately. His perfect features twisted into a snarl as he saw the look in my eyes. "Impossible," he hissed. "The connection was severed. The spirits were consumed. You are nothing now but dying flesh wrapped around an empty blade." "You're right," I said, my voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "The saints are gone. Their voices are silent. Their hunger for justice has been fed to your master's appetite." I drew Ordraxa fully, and the steel rang, with a sound like funeral bells. The blade was different now, no longer the warm, living metal that had housed 13 tortured souls, but something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. But justice doesn't require the dead to whisper guidance, I continued, taking a step toward the wavering form of the Pontifex. Justice doesn't need divine sanction or sacred mandate. Justice simply is. Lyanna understood before Malvain did. She moved away from the altar, giving me clear lines of approach while keeping her own weapon ready. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and terror as she watched me advance on the creature that had once been human. "Justice for Maria Constance, age 7, I said, raising the blade high. "Justice for Thomas Aldwyn, age 12. Justice for Elena Thorne, age 19. With each name, Ordraxa grew heavier in my hands. Not the supernatural weight it had carried when empowered by murdered souls, but the simple, inexorable weight of necessity. The weight of a choice made, and a line drawn, and a stand taken against the darkness. Justice for every innocent your church has consumed. Justice for every child fed to your master's hunger. Justice for every soul you've twisted into an instrument of suffering." Malvain raised the first martyr's blade to block my strike, but his weapon passed through mine like smoke through steel. The transformed dagger might have been able to wound souls and sever spirits, but it had no power over simple mortal determination. Ordraxa took him in the chest, driving through whatever passed for his heart, and emerging from his back in a spray of something that wasn't quite blood. The Pontifex's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and something that might have been fear. "How?" he gasped, his form beginning to solidify around the steel that pierced him. "You're nothing. No power, no divine mandate, no supernatural strength. Just a man with a piece of metal." "Sometimes," I said, driving the blade deeper until the crossguard pressed against his ribs. "That's enough." The first martyr's blade fell from his nerveless fingers and shattered against the obsidian altar, releasing a sound like 1,000 children screaming. The transparent sections of the chamber walls went dark, cutting off the visions of worldwide corruption and cosmic hunger. But Malvain wasn't finished. Even with 3 feet of consecrated steel through his chest, he managed one final act of spite. "You think you've won?" he wheezed, black ichor bubbling from his lips. "You think stopping me will change anything? The church still stands. The harvest continues. My master's hunger grows stronger with every soul consumed." He grabbed Ordraxa's blade with both hands, ignoring the way the steel cut through his palms. "And you, my perfect weapon, will carry that knowledge with you until the day you die. Every child you fail to save. Every innocent who suffers while you waste time on already dead monsters like me. Their blood will be on your hands." Then he spoke a word in a language that predated human speech, and the chamber exploded into chaos. The obsidian altar cracked down the middle with a sound like thunder. The stone floor bucked and heaved as something massive stirred far beneath the mountain. Chunks of rock began falling from the ceiling as the entire fortress shook on its foundations. But worse than the physical destruction was the psychic shockwave that accompanied Malvain's death. I felt it hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it visions of every atrocity the church had ever committed. Thousands of years of systematic murder, torture, and spiritual cannibalism, all focused into a single moment of absolute knowledge. I saw the truth behind the church's founding, the original compact with the entity Malvain had served, signed in the blood of innocents, and sealed with the sacrifice of the first martyr. I saw the careful corruption of legitimate faith, the transformation of genuine worship into something that fed on suffering, rather than offering hope. I saw the scope of the harvest, the sheer number of souls that had been consumed over the centuries. Millions of children taken from their families and fed to an appetite that could never be satisfied. Entire bloodlines erased from history to prevent anyone from asking uncomfortable questions. And I saw the future the church had been working toward. A world where innocence was nothing more than a resource to be harvested, where suffering was cultivated like crops in a field, where every human being existed solely to feed the hunger of something that should never have been allowed to exist. The knowledge was too much for any mortal mind to bear. I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges as I tried to process the full scope of what I'd uncovered. But before madness could claim me entirely, I felt Liana's hand on my shoulder, anchoring me to the present moment. "We have to go," she said urgently. "The whole mountain is coming down." She was right. The chamber was filling with dust and debris as the ceiling continued to collapse. We had maybe minutes before the entire structure buried us alive. I pulled Ordraxa free from Malvain's corpse and followed Liana toward the chamber's entrance. Behind us, the Pontifex's body was already beginning to dissolve, releasing clouds of noxious vapor that made the air itself seem to writhe. The escape from Geralt's Spire was a nightmare of crumbling stone and collapsing passages. We navigated by memory and instinct, often crawling through gaps barely wide enough for human bodies as the mountain's death throes continued around us. But we made it out, somehow against all odds. We emerged into the pre-dawn darkness just as the fortress's highest spire collapsed into the peak's crater. The entire structure folded in on itself, like a house of cards, taking with it centuries of accumulated evil and the physical manifestation of another worldly hunger. We sat on a ridge overlooking the destruction, watching the dust cloud rise into the storm-heavy sky. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There wasn't much to say in the face of such complete devastation. Finally, Liana broke the silence. "Is it over?" she asked. "Did we actually stop them?" I thought about Malvain's final words, about the network of corruption that stretched across the known world, about the thousands of church agents who were still out there, continuing their evil work. "We stopped this," I said, gesturing towards the ruined mountain. "But the church is bigger than one fortress, bigger than one group of conspirators. There are others out there, other servants of the Devourer, other innocents being prepared for harvest." I stood and strapped Ordraxa across my back. The weapon was quiet now, no longer singing its songs of justice or burning with supernatural fire. It was just a sword, forged from stolen bones and tempered in the blood of martyrs, wielded by a man who'd seen too much truth for his own good. "So, what do we do?" Liana asked. "We hunt," I said simply. "We find them, and we stop them, and we keep stopping them until there are none left to stop. And if we can't stop them all, if there are too many, spread too far." I looked down at the ruins of Geralt's Spire, at the place where a cosmic horror had tried to manifest in our world. The dust was already beginning to settle, and within a few years grass would grow over the rubble. Nature would reclaim what evil had tried to corrupt. "Then we do what we can," I said. "We save who we can save, and we make the guilty pay for what they've done, and we keep fighting until our strength gives out." She smiled at that, the first genuine expression of happiness I'd seen from her since we'd met. "I can live with that," she said. We parted ways at the base of the mountain. Liana went south, toward rumours of church activity in the coastal cities. I went north, following reports of missing children and suspicious clergy behaviour. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've walked thousands of miles and visited hundreds of towns and villages. I've infiltrated church facilities, interrogated corrupt priests, and freed dozens of children who were being prepared for the altars. I've killed more men than I can count, all of them guilty of crimes that would make demons weep. The blade has never sung for me again. It doesn't glow with holy fire, or guide my hand with supernatural precision. It's just a sword now, sharp and well balanced, and perfectly suited for the work I've chosen. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when I'm camped beside some nameless road, I think I can hear whispers in the wind. The voices of children who were saved from the harvest, growing up free and innocent in hidden places where the church's influence can't reach them. It's not the same as the guidance I once received from the 13 saints. It's quieter, more subtle, harder to distinguish from my own thoughts. But it's enough to keep me moving, to remind me that the work isn't finished, and never will be. The church still exists, though its power has been greatly diminished. The network of corruption Malvain spoke of is real, but it's not invincible. Every priest I kill, every child I save, every church facility I destroy makes the world a little bit safer for the innocent. I've learned to recognize the signs. Villages where too many children have gone missing. Clergy who preach about sacrifice with unusual enthusiasm. Churches built over older structures that radiate a wrongness that makes animals flee and plants wither. I've also learned to recognize my allies, other survivors of the church's atrocities who've taken up arms against their former captors, disillusioned knights who've discovered the truth about their sacred oaths, parents who've lost children to the harvest and want nothing more than revenge. We don't coordinate our efforts or share intelligence in any formal way. The church's spy network is too extensive for that kind of organization, but we know about each other, and sometimes our paths cross in useful ways. Last month, I found a church safe house in the border town of Millhaven, where they were holding 37 children destined for the forges. I freed them all and burned the building to the ground, but not before discovering documents that led me to 3 more facilities in neighbouring provinces. Those facilities are empty now too, their guards dead and their captives freed. The children have been dispersed to safe houses throughout the region, hidden among families who understand the importance of protecting innocence from those who would consume it. But for every facility I find, I know there are 10 more operating in secret. For every child I save, a dozen more disappear into the church's machinery of suffering. The work is endless, and I'm only one man with one sword. Still, I continue. Not because I believe I can win. The forces arrayed against innocence are too vast for any single person to overcome. I continue because the alternative is unthinkable. Because every child saved is a victory, no matter how small. Because justice doesn't require victory to be meaningful. The blade grows heavier with each passing year, but I've grown stronger too. Not with supernatural power or divine mandate, but with the simple, stubborn strength that comes from choosing to stand against the darkness no matter how hopeless the odds might seem. I know this story will end eventually. I'm mortal and the work is infinite. Someday I'll make a mistake or face an enemy I can't overcome, or simply grow too old and slow to continue the hunt. But until that day comes, I'll keep walking the roads between towns, carrying a sword forged from the bones of innocence and sharpened on the guilt of the damned. I'll keep hunting the priests and prelates and pontiffs who serve entities that should never be named. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, and very careful and very persistent, I'll make enough of a difference that when I'm gone, others will pick up where I left off. The church taught me that faith justifies violence, that belief can transform murder into sacrament, that the innocent exist only to serve the needs of the guilty. They were wrong about the faith and the belief, but they were absolutely right about one thing. Sometimes violence is justified, sometimes the guilty need to die, and sometimes a man with a sword is exactly what the world needs, even if that man carries more sins than saints and serves no god, but justice itself. Tonight feels different though. I can sense something in the air, a tension that makes my skin crawl and sets Ordraxa humming with anticipation. I'm camped in a grove of dead trees outside the village of Ravenscroft, where reports of missing children have drawn my attention. But it's not just children this time. Entire families have vanished from their homes, leaving behind meals half-eaten and beds still warm. The local priest, Father Matthias Crane, claims they've been called away on pilgrimages, but his eyes hold the same guilt I've learned to recognize in servants of the Devourer. More troubling are the sounds that come from the church at night, chanting in languages that predate human speech, and underneath it all, something that might be children crying, or screaming. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. I was planning to investigate tomorrow, to slip into the church and discover what horrors Crane is hiding in his basement. But as I sit here by my small fire, I realize I may not have the luxury of waiting, because I can hear them now, footsteps in the forest, multiple sets moving with the practiced stealth of church operatives who finally tracked their rogue knight to his temporary sanctuary. They've found me at last, after 3 years of hunting and hiding, and always staying one step ahead of their pursuit. Part of me is almost relieved. I've been running for so long that the thought of finally making a stand holds a certain appeal. I count at least a dozen men, from the sound of their movement, possibly more. Professional killers armed with consecrated weapons and blessed armor, sent to eliminate a threat to their unholy order. They think they know what they're facing. A single knight with a stolen blade, exhausted from years of futile resistance. They're wrong. I stand and draw Ordraxa, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in my hands. The sword doesn't sing, or glow, or manifest any supernatural power. It's just steel and bone and the accumulated guilt of everyone I've killed in service to justice. But sometimes that's enough. The first assassin steps into my firelight with crossbow raised, his black robes marked with symbols that hurt to perceive. Behind him, I can see the shapes of his companions, moving through the trees, trying to surround my position. Callas Verrow, he says, his voice muffled by a mask that looks like it was carved from a human skull. By order of His Holiness Pontifex Severus, you are commanded to surrender and submit to judgment for crimes against the faith. The only judgment here, I reply, taking a step toward him, is the one I'm about to deliver. He fires his crossbow, but I'm already moving. The bolt whistles past my ear as I close the distance between us, Ordraxa cutting through his guard and opening his throat in a spray of arterial red. He goes down without another word, his blood steaming in the cold night air. The others attack from all sides at once, thinking to overwhelm me with sheer numbers, but they've made a crucial mistake. They still think I'm the same faithful knight who once served their order. They expect me to fight with honor, to show mercy, to hesitate when facing men who share my former faith. They don't understand what I've become. The battle is brutal and swift. I move through their ranks like a force of nature, Ordraxa finding gaps in armor and weak points in defenses with supernatural precision. Not because the blade guides my hand, but because I've had 3 years to perfect the art of killing those who serve the Devourer. When it's over, 12 men lie dead around my campfire, their blood seeping into soil that will never grow anything green again. I'm wounded. A crossbow bolt in my left shoulder, a sword cut across my ribs. But I'm alive, and they're not. That's what matters. I tend to my wounds as best I can, and break camp immediately. If they found me once, they'll find me again, and next time they'll send more men. Better men. I need to stay mobile, keep moving, complete my work in Ravenscroft before the church can marshal a larger force. As I pack my gear, I notice something that makes my blood run cold. One of the dead assassins is wearing a pendant I recognize. A silver chain holding a small vial of what looks like liquid starlight. It's a phylactery, a container for captured souls, and inside it I can see tiny faces pressing against the glass. Children's faces. The church has been harvesting souls on a massive scale, storing them in portable containers for transport to whatever hellish forges they're using now. This single vial holds at least a dozen innocent spirits, trapped and tormented for purposes I don't want to imagine. I shatter the phylactery against a stone, and the souls within escape in streamers of light that rise toward the stars. For just a moment, I hear their voices, whispers of gratitude and relief as they finally find peace. It's a small victory, but it reminds me why I fight. Not for grand gestures or cosmic justice, but for moments like this. for the chance to free even a few souls from the darkness that would consume them. I reach Ravenscroft as the first light of dawn touches the eastern horizon. The village is smaller than I expected, maybe 50 houses clustered around a central square, with the church dominating one end, like a stone cancer. The building is old, much older than the village itself. Its foundation stones carved with symbols that predate Christianity by millennia. The place feels wrong, not just evil but fundamentally corrupt, as if the very air has been poisoned by whatever rituals take place within those walls. Birds won't fly over the church, and the few animals I see give it a wide berth, as if their instincts warn them away from something their minds can't comprehend. I find a vantage point in the ruins of an old watchtower and settle in to observe. For several hours, nothing happens. The village seems almost deserted, with only a few people moving about their daily business. But then, around midday, I see something that makes my blood boil. Father Crane emerges from the church leading a procession of children. 23 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, all wearing white robes and moving with the mechanical precision of the drugged or enchanted. Their eyes are vacant, staring at nothing, and their lips move constantly in silent prayer. They're being prepared for sacrifice, made ready for the altars where their innocence will be harvested and their souls fed to the Devourer's endless hunger. I watch them disappear into the church's depths, then begin planning my assault. The building has only 2 entrances, the main doors and a smaller side entrance used by the clergy. There are probably basement levels where the real work takes place, hidden chambers where screams can't be heard and blood can be properly channeled. I'll have to move fast. Every minute I delay is another minute those children spend in terror, another moment closer to their transformation into raw material for consecrated weapons. As the sun sets, I make my move. The church doors are unlocked, an arrogance that speaks to Crane's confidence in his security measures. I slip inside and find myself in a nave that's been transformed into something out of a nightmare. The pews have been removed and replaced with ritual circles carved into the stone floor. The altar has been stained black with substances I don't want to identify, and hanging from the rafters are dozens of cages, each one containing what looks like a human heart that still beats with unnatural rhythm. The sound of chanting draws me deeper into the building, down stone steps that descend far below the church's foundation. The walls are lined with alcoves containing more phylacteries, hundreds of them, each one pulsing with trapped souls. This isn't just a processing centre, it's a warehouse, a storage facility for the church's harvest of innocence. I follow the sound of voices to a vast underground chamber where I find Father Crane and a dozen acolytes conducting their obscene ritual. The 23 children are arranged in a circle around a pit that seems to descend into the earth's core. Their white robes have been removed, revealing bodies covered in ritual scarification and brands that glow with their own inner fire. At the pit's edge stands an altar made from fused human bones, and upon it lies something that makes my vision blur, just to perceive it. Not because it's difficult to see, but because my mind refuses to process what it's seeing, a mass of writhing shadow and hungry darkness that pulses with malevolent intelligence. A fragment of the Devourer itself, a piece of the cosmic horror that the church serves, manifesting in our reality to personally oversee this harvest. Crane sees me first, his face splitting into a grin that reveals teeth filed to points. "Brother Callas," he says, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "How good of you to join us. You're just in time for the culmination of our work." "Let the children go," I say, drawing Ordraxa. The blade seems heavier than usual, as if it too is affected by the presence of the thing on the altar. "Oh, but they're going somewhere wonderful," Crane replies. They're going to become part of something greater than they ever could have achieved in their mundane little lives. Their suffering will birth new weapons, new instruments of divine will. The children begin to scream then, as whatever drugs had kept them docile wear off and they realize their situation. The sound is heartbreaking, pure terror and desperation that echoes off the chamber walls like a chorus of the damned. Their pain feeds it, Crane continues, gesturing towards the writhing mass on the altar. Every sob, every whimper, every cry for help makes it stronger. Soon it will be strong enough to rip a permanent rift between worlds, to bring its full essence into our reality. That's when I realize the true scope of what's happening here. This isn't just another harvest, another group of children being processed for their spiritual essence. This is the final phase of a plan, centuries in the making, the complete manifestation of the Devourer in our world. If I fail here, if I can't stop this ritual, then everything I've fought for, everyone I've saved, will be meaningless. The entity will rip reality itself apart in its hunger, consuming not just innocence, but everyone, everything, until nothing remains but darkness and screaming. I charge. The acolytes try to stop me, but they're scholars and torturers, not warriors. Ordraxa cuts through them, like wheat before a scythe, their blood spattering the walls as I fight my way towards the altar. Crane himself raises some kind of consecrated staff, but the weapon shatters against my blade like glass. The fragment of the Devourer writhes on its bone altar, its form shifting between shapes that shouldn't exist. Sometimes it looks like a massive spider made of hungry darkness. Sometimes it resembles a tree whose branches end in grasping hands. Sometimes it's nothing but teeth and eyes and an appetite that could swallow worlds. As I approach, it speaks without words, its voice echoing directly in my mind. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it says, each word feeling like ice picks driven into my skull. "The ritual is complete. The gateway is open. I'm already more real than the reality you seek to protect." "Maybe," I say, raising Ordraxa high above the altar, "but you're not real enough to survive this." I bring the blade down with all my strength, driving it deep into the center of the writhing mass. The thing screams, not with sound but with pure psychic agony that sends every living thing in the chamber to its knees. The children stop crying, the acolytes stop breathing, even the stone walls crack under the pressure of that inhuman shriek. But the blade holds. More than that, it drinks. Ordraxa begins to glow with the same light I once saw in the phylacteries, but brighter, more intense. The weapon draws the Devourer's essence into itself, trapping the cosmic horror within steel and bone just as it had once trapped the souls of murdered saints. The fragment fights back, trying to corrupt the blade, to turn it into an instrument of its own will. For a moment, I feel the weapon wavering in my hands, torn between its purpose as an instrument of justice and the overwhelming hunger of the thing it's trying to contain. That's when I hear them, the voices of the 13 saints, faint but growing stronger. Maria and Thomas and Eleanor and all the others, their spirits returning to aid in this final battle. Not as trapped souls crying for vengeance, but as willing allies in the fight against an evil that threatens everything they died to protect. Together, we bind the Devourer's fragment within the blade, sealing it away where it can do no more harm. The cosmic horror's screams grow fainter and fainter until they fade to nothing, leaving only silence in the vast chamber. The children are alive, traumatized, wounded, forever changed by what they've witnessed, but alive. I free them from their bonds and lead them from the chamber, away from the altar, where something that should never have existed finally learned the meaning of death. The village of Ravenscroft burns that night, not from my hand, but from the survivors of Crane's congregation, finally understanding what they had allowed to take root in their midst. They burn the church and every building that bears the church's taint, purifying their home with cleansing fire. The children will be safe. I've arranged for them to be taken to one of Lyanna's safe houses, where they'll receive the care they need to heal from their ordeal. Some may never fully recover from what they've experienced, but they'll live. They'll have a chance to grow up free from the darkness that would have consumed them. As for me, I continue walking the roads. The blade is different now, heavier than ever, weighted down by the cosmic horror trapped within its steel. Sometimes I can hear it whispering, trying to corrupt my thoughts, promising power beyond imagination if I'll just let it free. I ignore the whispers. I've learned to recognize the voice of evil, no matter how seductive it tries to sound. The Church of the Ninefold Flame is broken now, its network of corruption scattered, and its ultimate goal thwarted. There may be isolated cells still operating, individual priests still serving the darkness, but the organized threat is ended. That doesn't mean my work is finished. Evil takes many forms, and innocence will always need protection from those who would exploit it. But, for the first time in 3 years, I allow myself to feel something like hope. The world is a little bit safer tonight, a little bit brighter. A cosmic horror has been bound, and 23 children will grow up free. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes a man with a sword really can make a difference. The blade hums softly as I walk, but it's not the hungry song of trapped souls, or the seductive whisper of cosmic evil. It's something new, a quiet hymn of justice served and innocence protected. For the first time since this all began, Sanct Ordraxa sounds almost peaceful, but peace is a luxury I can't afford for long. There are other villages out there, other children in danger, other servants of darkness who need to be stopped. The hunt continues, and I'll be ready when it calls.